developed domestic energy sources have been hampered by the concerns of the environmentalists. How would you address this issue, critical to the growth of our economy and future prosperity?
I mean, part of it is you have to separate. In many cases, the environmentalists are just socialists in disguise, and they're using the environment as a way to advance their socialist agenda. You have to see, there are some legitimate environmental concerns, but you have to separate that from the radical environmentalists that is simply, where they want to, they want to stop the development of some, I guess there's a little snail darter or some kind of, what was the word I'm looking for, but insignificant, little fish that can't go extinct. I mean, there are more animals that are extinct than that are still alive. I mean, extinction is a natural process of evolution, right? Species go extinct. And it doesn't mean that we have to figure out every single species that exists and make sure that it never goes extinct. I mean, we don't, there doesn't have to be, let's say there's, 1,000 species of worms. I mean, as one of them goes away, does it really, we can't look at every little worm and say, aha, we can't build a factory here, we can't have a mine there, because that one little species of worm isn't going to exist anymore. Well, how do we know? Maybe it's not supposed to exist. So you have to separate that. There's a lot of it's socialist, and they try to get their agenda through that environmentalist smokescreen. So we have to get by that and be rational about protecting the big picture and the environment, but not letting the concerns of these radical environmentalists get in the way. But even more so than that, it's just all the other rules and regulations that make business and developing resources in this country so expensive. The government raises the bar that it's just too costly, you can't do it economical. It's still cheaper to import it than develop our own resources because of what the government does. And you can look at, there are plenty of poor countries all around the world that are sitting on resources. Why can't they develop them? Because there is no free market. There is too much government, so it doesn't happen.
Federal accounting mechanisms appear to be malleable according to the needs of the moment. Currently, the Obama administration seeks to obscure the true cost of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac mortgage houses by categorizing them as private entities, thereby keeping the price of their bailouts off the books. How would you address this fluctuating accounting rules which keep the cost of government hidden?
First, just to add on to what you said about Fannie Mae, that I saw the head of Fannie Mae, and I forget what the guy's name was, on television a couple years ago, and he was announcing a brand new policy for Fannie Mae. It was a brand new policy. The policy was they were only going to insure mortgages where the borrowers could afford to pay the money back. And, the anchor was like, well, what do you mean? I mean, that's not, you didn't have that policy before? And I was like, talk about closing the barn door after the horse had left. But this is what they said. I'm not making this stuff up. They had adjustable rate mortgages. And they said it was Freddie's policy. They had their guidelines that said, okay, we're only going to insure a mortgage if it's no more than 35% or whatever it was of your income. Right? That was the cap. But if you took out an ARM, they only looked at the teaser rate. Right? They didn't look at the level that it could adjust to when the teaser expired. So even if the adjustment rate proved to be more than 100% of what you earned, they would still approve it. And what they said is, well, going forward, we're actually going to make sure that you can afford the higher rate that it sets to, not just the introductory rate. And the anchor's like, well, why did you do that? Why did you do that all along? I mean, it seems basic, right? And they said, well, people were making a lot of money in the real estate market, and so we didn't want to tell people that they couldn't buy a house. We wanted to give them the opportunity to profit. So in other words, Fannie and Freddie were subsidizing speculating. They saw speculating, and they didn't want to do anything to stop it. I mean, that was with government guarantees. Look, the problem with government accounting, when you see these politicians criticizing Wall Street or any private sector company for fraud or accounting, the biggest fraud in accounting is the federal government. Their budget is a complete and total lie. The national debt, which they report, which is about $12.5 trillion, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? The debt on Freddie and Fannie that the question talks about, that debt is off the books. But the federal government has already stated that it stands behind all that debt, $6 trillion. They've already coughed up like several hundred billion, into Fannie, but they backed them up. Well, why isn't that $6 trillion part of the national debt? Why isn't it subject to the debt ceiling? It should be.
The government owes the money now. It assumed the debt. And there's all sorts of off-budget, off-balance sheet items that are not included. Well, how could you do that? If you owe money, how can you just say, well, I don't really owe it because I shifted it off my balance sheet? Yeah, but you still owe it. If anybody in the private sector did that, they'd be in jail. And, that's what Enron was doing, right? And it's even bigger. Most companies, if you get a balance sheet and you look at their liabilities, they also report their contingency liabilities. Now, what's the difference? A real liability is if I borrow money, I have to pay it back. That's a liability. But what if I guaranteed somebody else's debt? Well, that's a contingency liability because I might owe it. And what you're required to do is assess a value based on a statistical probability. How much exposure do you have on that contingency liability, right? Well, the federal government doesn't report one nickel in contingency liabilities, despite the fact that it has $10 trillion in Social Security, $30 trillion in Medicare. I'm not sure what it is in student loans that they've guaranteed or other guarantees. And of course, every time they have something for emergencies, off the budget, if they have to spend money on, if you're as a household and, you have an emergency, you can't put the expense off budget, it's on your budget. They just say, well, we're not going to count it because it was emergency. Well, you still spent it. So the whole thing is fraud. There's, the truth in accounting, those laws should apply to the government first. The government should be forced to our statement of its assets and liabilities so we can really appreciate the true nature of our insolvency and maybe force the leaders to do something about reining in the debt and spending.
Thank you. A recent Wall Street Journal op-ed claimed that it is pointless to audit the Fed as it publicly publishes its financial statements on a weekly basis. However, dating back to the 1970s with the passage of the CRA, Fed chairs have been increasingly aligning financial policy to the federal administration's policies. What information would be gained from such an audit, and what impact would this information have on potential policy?
I'm sure we learned a lot of very disturbing stuff, which is exactly why the government doesn't want it to happen. It's very ironic that one of the reasons that they claim that we can't audit the Fed is that we don't want to compromise its independence. Its independence was compromised a long time ago. There's nothing left to compromise. The whole thing is politicized. When they slashed interest rates down to 1% following the bursting of the dot-com bubble, that wasn't good economic policy. That was done for politics. That was done to help re-elect George Bush. When they slashed interest rates down to 0%, this time, it was to stimulate the economy. It's to help incumbent politicians get reelected. The whole thing is politicized. At this point, it is so politicized that we need to audit them to find out what these guys are doing, because they're not doing anything good. And the interesting thing is, in this new financial regulation bill that they just wrote in the Senate, it is actually going to completely take the legs out from under the Audit the Fed bill that passed the House. And still hasn't been voted on in the Senate. But what they slipped into this bill basically makes it impossible to even do that. So it basically negates what the House did. And they slipped it in to the financial regulation bill. So the powers that be in Washington do not want the Fed audited. They do not want the public knowing what these guys are doing. Because what they're really doing is artificially propping up a phony economy, but creating a ticking time bomb that's going to explode sometime in the near future, and our politicians don't want that exposed. They want the Federal Reserve financing their deficits, and they don't care how they do it. They just want them to do it.